Genesis chapter 7, verse 20 through 21, the exact same chapter, says this: the waters rose and covered what? The mountains, okay? To a depth of more than 20 feet. Hello, this was not local. It was all over the world. And here's the point. Every living thing that moved on the earth, in case you don't realize, the birds, the livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm all over the earth, and all mankind died. Folks, for the second time in the exact same chapter, the Bible clearly says to you and I, not just a few things died here and there. This was not some local event. But once again, what did it say? It said tons and tons and tons of creatures, all kinds of creatures, including mankind, died everywhere, right? And so that's the obvious question. Do we see any signs, not just of a sudden burial, but do we see any signs of a massive burial? Tons and tons of carcasses. Slightly, folks. Check this out. First of all, they find so many tons and tons of dead things all over the world, not just locally, that they actually have a name for them, folks. They're called dinosaur graveyards, okay? Now, here's what's interesting. They not only find tons and tons of fossils, but they find them all jumbled up, thrown together in a completely disordered mass. That's exactly what you'd expect to find in a sudden, violent worldwide flood. In fact, there's so many animals jam-packed in these graveyards, they are oftentimes 2 to 3 miles thick of bone. And they're all over the world. Shocker. Can we really take the Genesis account literally? Let's put it to the test. Do we see any evidence, here's the point, outside the Bible, that there really were giant people both before and after the flood? Of course. Thanks for asking, Chuck. You're on the ball. How about some giant prints? These people were huge, folks, mega huge. Let's take a look. Giant man tracks have been found in the Paluxy River near Glen Rose, Texas, after a flood washed away a portion of the shore. Okay, literally a flood went there and just lifted up a whole section of rock and exposed what was there the whole time in the fossil record. The problem was the tracks were found in a formation that was supposed to be 120 to 130 million years old. What are man tracks doing back then? I'd say something's messed up, as we saw before. It is. But that's the tip of the iceberg, folks. Not only were human tracks found in the formation, but there were also dinosaur tracks found right next to them. That's one of the actual photos. That's the human prints going this way, and a dinosaur is going that way. Explain that one, evolutionists. It makes sense for the Christian, but they can't explain it. And let's continue on. The human tracks were of good number, and the large toe was clearly visible. And some of the tracks showed signs of a foot covering like a thin sandal or moccasin. In fact, one fossil print was so well preserved that the impression of the lacing was still on it. It's almost like man and animal were all running away from something. I wonder what that was, Dan. Rhymes with worldwide flood. Hey, you're on the ball. You got it right. Hey, let's continue on. Here's the whole point with giantism. Some of the human tracks that they found with the dinosaurs, they were 21.5 inches long. They had a 7-foot stride in between the next track. As one guy said, I'd rip my britches every single time trying to do that. You know what I'm saying? Not just huge, but man, the stride. Whoa, that was just walking. Okay, true giants in the sense of the word. And so the 21.5 inch long foot would be somebody approximately 12 feet tall. That's a big dude. Okay, but that's not all. That's the tip of the iceberg. In 1932, near Alamogordo, New Mexico, 13 giant tracks were found by Ellis Wright, and each of those tracks were 22 inches long as well. In the Megalong Valley in Australia, an impression of a large human foot-like print was found in ironstone protruding there from the creek bank. The footprint measured 7 inches across the toes, and had it been complete, it had been almost 2 feet long, making the person, again, approximately 12 feet tall or better. But that's not all. A man named Noel Reeves found near Kimsey, Australia, a series of monstrous footprints, listen to this, in the sandstone beds on the upper Macleay River. One print shows a toe span of 10 inches, the toe span, suggesting the owner of the print may have been 17 feet tall. That's a big dude. But wait a second, if you got giant prints, you got giant people. Hey folks, this really happened. A skeleton was found in a coal mine in Italy that was 11.5 feet long. You see, because people would say these prints, oh, somebody faked them, they faked them, blah, blah, blah. Well, then explain the skeletons they find that are huge as well. That was one of them found in Italy. But that's not all. One report says the government of Turkey claims to have found the grave of Noah. The skeleton, they said, was over 12 feet tall, which would make Noah's cubit a little bigger, wouldn't it? As one guy says, how big was that ark anyway? That's kind of interesting. We don't have time to get into that. Another guy, 1877, 4 prospectors were looking for gold and silver near Eureka, Nevada. And upon scanning some of the rocks, they noticed something that was jutting out from the high ledge up there. So their guys, what do they do, Dan? They go check it out. That's right, they go check it out. And that's what they did. They got a better look at it, and they discovered that what was jutting out was a human leg bone and kneecap sticking straight out of the rock. First of all, how'd it get in rock? We know that was from the time of the flood. That's one issue, but here's the point. Several medical doctors examined the remains and were convinced that anatomically they had indeed belonged to a human, quote, a very modern-looking one. Not some ape-like creature, but a modern-looking human being. But the intriguing thing was the size of the bones. From the knee to the heel, they measured 39 inches, which means, again, their owner would have been over 12 feet tall. That's a big dude. But that's still not all. 1833, soldiers were digging a pit for a powder magazine in Lompoc Rancho, California, and discovered a male skeleton 12 feet tall. The skeleton was surrounded by stone axes, carved shells, some blocks that had some unintelligible symbols on it, and the bones verified the legends of the local people there, the Paiute Indians, who had a legend of giant people that they called the Saiticas. Maybe those Indians weren't so crazy after all in some of their legends. They apparently knew better. In 1878, in Ashtabula, Ohio, a farmer, was cultivating the soil when he discovered the remains of bones that must have belonged, obviously, to a race of giants, and here's why. The skull, that's a normal-sized skull. Do you see the skull there on the left? Look how big that thing is. The skull and jaw were of such a size that the skull could cover the man's head, and the jaw could have easily slipped over his face, as though the head were enveloping his own. Do you like that one? Yeah, I need like that one. That's sound effects too, man. This is awesome. Okay, let's continue on. According to the San Francisco Examiner, a body of a petrified giant was found by two farmers that were sinking a well 10 miles outside of town. The body was reported to be as hard as flint, petrified. The body itself was complete, and the arms and leg had broken off. The article also states that the veins in the ribs were still plainly very visible, and later a group of men were dispatched to retrieve the arms and legs, which were still in the hole where the giant was found, who was approximately 12 feet tall. But that's not all. New York Times in 1925 reported how an American engineer found in the mountains of western Chihuahua the skeleton of a man that was 12 feet tall. But he wasn't alone. Listen to this. All around that guy were other skeletons of men so big that even in their sitting posture, they still rose 6 feet high. Sitting down. Like columns is what the report says. But that's not all. The New York Times in 1902 reported how a giant 12-foot skeleton was found about 200 miles southwest of the Las Vegas, Nevada area. And the men who opened the grave said the forearm alone, the forearm was 4 feet long, and the teeth ranged from size from that of a hickory nut to the largest of walnuts. And the circumference of the chest area was 7 feet around. Dan, rugby, that dude. Yeah, flanker, right on. Hey, but that's not all. This is a recent one, unless you think it doesn't happen today. It does, folks. 1950s, during the road construction of the Euphrates Valley of the southeast Turkey, many tombs containing the remains of giants were uncovered. And that's the actual photo there. That's the femur leg bone right there. That's the actual guy, folks. Look at the size of that guy. At the sites, the leg bones were measured to be 47.24 inches long. Okay, almost 4 feet long, just the femur bone. Here's a close-up, folks. Joe Taylor, of the director of the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum, was commissioned to sculpt the femur, and it belonged to a person estimated to be 14 to 16 feet tall. That's the actual photograph. Wow, it's almost like somebody's not telling us stuff. Well, that's why, folks, we need to look at some giant quotes. Researchers is telling us, folks, they're being covered up. I wonder why. One guy said this: outside the scientific theater, there are a number of skeletons, skulls, and footprints of giants. Even more mysterious is the seemingly unanimous decisions by the keeper of the world's museums and archaeological treasures to keep the physical evidence of giants hidden from public view. I wonder why. Only a smattering of the evidence is available to obscure locations. Thousands of skeletons and hundreds of historical reports are ignored. The accepted knowledge among the world's peoples is that giants are the creatures of myth and folklore, relegated to children's fairy tales and B-grade horror movies. Quote, the reality is, giants were present throughout our history. Exactly like the Bible says. One other guy says this: perhaps not equal in quality, but certainly in rivaling in quantity. Listen, are the archives of guess who? The Smithsonian Institution. And in those archives, only open to government officials, lie the bones of many thousands of corpses, dug up, described, and stored without study for the last century and a half. Scores, if not hundreds of these skeletons are considered giants, and yet they lie, listen, deteriorating, not finding the slightest interest from anthropologists, wanting no part in rocking the neatly defined prehistoric model, evolution. The researchers ignore them now, and there is no sign this will ever change. Sounds to me like somebody doesn't want this information to get out. But what's the whole point in sharing this, folks? The Bible is clear. What? It isn't just because the Bible says so. That should be good enough. But what? There is tons of evidence outside the Bible. Yes, you can take the whole Genesis account literally. There was giants both before and there was giants after the time of Noah's flood, right? Why in the world do we feel compelled that we have to shrink back in fear? And here's the second point. If we find every single one of these items in the Genesis account to be taken literally, when God warns that he is going to judge this planet a second time, why don't we take that literally? How much more proof does he have to give us? But that still is not all. Not only in the pre-flood world we had the right conditions for giant ages, giant plants, and yes, even giant peoples we just saw. But I'm telling you folks, everything got big in the pre-flood world, including the fifth evidence of giant life forms, and that is from giant creatures. Here's Dr. Kenneth E. Campbell in front of a 25-foot wingspan of a bird there, Argentavis magnificens, displayed at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. That's a big bird. Ground sloths today that grow only to the size of a monkey, found in the fossil record 20 feet tall. Oh, this is the actual photograph. Builders have found in the fossil remains of a giant armadillo in southern Peru that's the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. That thing they're around, that's not a rock, that's its head. That's the head of the giant armadillo.